for the Russians. His first crack at refuting that report was tepid over the weekend. Today, he has significantly turned up the volume on his pushback. He is also keeping the criticism of Democrats for their role and his role in the partial government shutdown front and center. We have Fox team coverage. Britt Hume on how the president keeps fighting back against the Russia probe and how that may be affecting his poll numbers. Catherine Herridge with the reaction to the allegations about the president's loyalties. But we start off with Chief White House correspondent John Roberts and a most unusual accusation against an American commander-in-chief. Good evening, John.
Brett, good evening to you. It really was an extraordinary pair of news reports, one accusing the president of trying to sell out his country to the Russians, the other accusing the president of trying to hide from his senior aides the contents of meetings with Vladimir Putin. As you can imagine, the president came out swinging hard against both. Leaving the White House for New Orleans today, President Trump slammed the report that the FBI was looking into whether he was working on behalf of Russia after he fired James Comey.
I never worked for Russia. I think it's a disgrace that you even asked that question because it's a whole big fat hoax.
According to the New York Times, the FBI leadership became so concerned about the president's behavior at the time that they began an inquiry into whether President Trump was engaged in un-American activities. On the South Lawn this morning, President Trump reminded who was leading the Russia investigation.
The people doing that investigation were people that have been caught that are known scoundrels. I guess you could say, they're dirty cops.
President Trump also took aim at a Washington Post report that he went to extraordinary lengths to keep from senior aides the details of meetings he had with Russian President Vladimir Putin, even going so far as to take the notes of a translator after their July 2017 meeting in Hamburg.
I have those meetings one-on-one with all leaders, including the President of China, including Prime Minister of Japan, Abe. We have those meetings all the time. No big deal.
But Democrats found all the news about Putin reason enough to keep the Mueller investigation going.
That was a concerning, even alarming report, and it suggests to me that the Mueller investigation needs to continue to its logical conclusion.
In New Orleans today, President Trump tried to keep up the pressure on Democrats to make a deal on border security and reopen the government.
When it comes to keeping the American people safe, I will never, ever back down.
In a speech to the Farm Bureau, attempting to flip the script and blame Democrats for federal workers not getting their paychecks.
I'm asking all of our citizens to call your Democrat lawmakers and ask them to pass a bill that secures our border, protects our country, and now reopens our government.
But on his way out the door to New Orleans this morning, President Trump again indicated no appetite for declaring a national emergency to build the wall.
I'm not looking to call a national emergency. This is so simple you shouldn't have to. Now, I have the absolute legal right to call it, but I'm not looking to do that because this is too simple.
Republican Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who does support the idea of a national emergency declaration, had a suggestion yesterday saying, well, maybe the president could reopen government for a brief period, perhaps about 3 weeks. And if he doesn't get a negotiation with the Democrats on border security before then all bets are off. President Trump politely rejected that idea this morning, saying as long as the Democrats refuse to negotiate, the government will remain shut down. Brett?
John Roberts live on the North Lawn. John, thanks. Let's dig a little deeper into the accusation about the president doing the Russians' bidding and how Republicans are reacting to that. Here's Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge.
Congressional testimony from the FBI's former top lawyer, General Counsel James A. Baker, reveals that senior FBI leadership debated whether the president's decision to fire Director James Comey was secretly directed by the Russian government. House Republican John Ratcliffe, whose questions first uncovered the revelation, told Fox, quote, in May 2017, political bias infected senior FBI leadership, and emotion, not evidence, drove their decision-making. Ratcliffe continued. FBI senior senior leadership could not accept, Comey was fired for cause, and the president had the constitutional authority to terminate Comey. While no actual evidence of guilt has emerged, Fox News can confirm that senior FBI leadership was disturbed by the president's comments apparently linking Comey's termination to Moscow, including an Oval Office meeting where he told the Russian foreign minister the firing eased the pressure.
There's been a confusing and at times even alarming tendency on the part of President Trump to compliment President Putin that's led many of us to question his closeness to and his affinity for President Putin.
It tells me a lot about the people running the FBI. I don't trust them as far as I throw them. And what I want to do is make sure, how could the FBI do that? What kind of checks and balances are there?
And today, the Democratic chairman of the House Intelligence and Foreign Affairs Committee said they are considering a subpoena for notes taken by President Trump's translator during a 2017 meeting, as John mentioned, with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Brett.
Tomorrow we'll have the full coverage of the Attorney General nominee's hearing up on Capitol Hill, and we're learning more about AG nominee Bill Barr's thinking on the special counsel in advance of tomorrow's confirmation hearings.
Well, that's right, Brett. According to prepared remarks released today, the nominee for Attorney General said of the Mueller report, quote, "My goal will be to provide as much transparency as I can consistent with the law. I will make those judgments based solely on the law and will let no personal, political, or other improper interests influence my decision." Today, the ACLU said it's pressing senators to explore Barr's position on presidential authorities and mass data collection.
They have to vigorously question him about his views on executive power, on what he thinks the limits of the president's power are, and how he will defend the Fourth Amendment. You know, whether he will really scale back surveillance programs that we know raise significant constitutional and privacy concerns.
The hearings start tomorrow here on Fox and are scheduled over the next couple of days, Brett.
And we'll have that here on Fox. Catherine, thanks. President Trump's almost daily self-defense over the Russia probe may have been having a negative influence on his popularity in the polls, plus his position on the partial government shutdown and what comes next. Senior political analyst Brit Hume is here to look at the numbers and discuss those things. Good evening, Brit. We want to start with this the shutdown and the positioning. You know, we're seeing polls that don't look good for the president and the GOP. Your thoughts on this, and if there's a turning point in this whole back and forth?
Well, we've been here before, haven't we, Brett? Government shut down, and people blame the Republicans. In only one case, and that was the so-called Schumer shutdown a year or so ago, has that not been the case. Mostly, I think, because people perceive the Republicans as the party that wants to shrink the government, and the Democrats as the party of government. So it's a natural tendency to blame the Republicans for a shutdown, especially when their leader, in this case President Trump, publicly says he'll take the blame, and he's getting it, and it's affecting, I think, his poll numbers in a way that was basically inevitable.
Interestingly, in the poll, the ABC Washington Post poll, building the border wall has now increased fairly significantly, as we haven't seen those numbers move in recent weeks and months, up to 42% now, as talk about the border increases.
Yeah, and I think, Brett, that gives the president a little hope that at some point that he and the Democrats, you know, these two parties seem to have painted themselves into opposite corners of the same room and can't see a way out of it at the moment. And the obvious way out of it would be for the Democrats to give some ground on funding the border barrier or wall or whatever you choose to call it, and the president to give some ground on immigration reforms that the Democrats want. I think he's shown some willingness to do that. At particular times, he's lowered his dollar request for funding the barrier. But at this point, I think the Democrats seem to think that he is in such bad shape politically that they can force on him a total surrender on this issue and really humiliate him. But if that doesn't work and the government remains closed, at some point people are going to say, "Well, come on, Democrats, you can give a little ground on the border." And I noticed Senator Coons over the weekend was saying, for example, that he didn't really agree with Nancy Pelosi's assessment that the border wall is immoral. Of course, it'd be pretty hard to argue that in light of the fact that, you know, Democrats have voted for funding for the wall before. So, I mean, there's obviously something for the president to hang his hat on here in poll results that are otherwise not very good for him.
Yeah, I just want to play this soundbite. This is the president first reacting on Judge Jeanine's show about this New York Times story that he was working for the Russians, and then today.
I think it's the most insulting thing I've ever been asked. I think it's the most insulting article I've ever had written. And if you read the article, you'd see that they found absolutely nothing.
I never worked for Russia, and you know that answer better than anybody. I never worked for Russia. Not only did I never work for Russia, I think it's a disgrace that you even asked that question.
You know, a lot of parsing about his answers. But, you know, in that story, Britt, 9th paragraph down, it did say that they didn't have any evidence that this came to be.
Well, you know, what was fascinating over the weekend was when he didn't directly deny that that he'd worked for Russia in the question that he got from Judge Pirro. And if you think about that for a second, Brett, it's quite almost amusing, because in order to believe that that was significant, that he didn't directly deny it, you'd have to believe that A, he did do it, that he was working for Russia, and B, that he was too honest to lie about it. I don't think many of his critics actually believe that, so that was all kind of silly, but he seems now to have made a pretty firm denial, which is where we are.
That's where we are as we await the Mueller report. Britt, thank you very much. The top Republican in Congress is tearing into one of his own tonight. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says Iowa Republican Congressman Steve King might want to consider getting a new job. Last week, King was quoted by the New York Times, as we've reported here, saying, "White nationalist, white supremacist, Western civilization, how did that language become offensive?" King has since said he rejects such labels, and that was a rookie mistake. This afternoon, McConnell said there is no place in the Republican Party, the Congress, or the country for an ideology of racial supremacy of any kind. I have no tolerance for such positions, and those who espouse these views are not supporters of American ideals and freedoms. Representative King's statements are unwelcome and unworthy of his elected position. If he doesn't understand why white supremacy is offensive, he should find another line of work. Also today, Illinois Democratic Congressman Bobby Rush introduced a resolution to censure King. House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn says a reprimand will do. President Trump says he has not been following the controversy, and late this afternoon, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy met with King. So far, no one involved is commenting on that meeting. The president's top diplomat is supporting his boss's threat to cause economic devastation to a major American ally. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is heading back from the Middle East region after an effort to try to get some of the country's most important friends to act a little friendlier toward each other. State Department correspondent Rich Edson reports from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Riyadh. Their second meeting here in 3 months to discuss Yemen, Iran, and Syria. The secretary also defended President Trump's tweet threatening to devastate Turkey economically if it attacks Kurdish forces in Syria. Turkey partners in the fight against ISIS.
We want to make sure that the folks who fought with us to take down the Caliphate and ISIS have security, and also that terrorists acting out of Syria aren't able to attack Turkey. The precise methodology which by we will achieve that security for both of those elements along that border is something we're still working on.
Turkey's foreign minister responded that his country is never afraid of threats, and strategic partners should never communicate through social media. On the war in Yemen, a Saudi-led coalition is fighting Iranian-backed Houthi forces. The State Department says the U.S. and Saudi Arabia agreed on the need for continued de-escalation. Pompeo arrived in Riyadh from Doha, the capital of Saudi Arabia's neighbor and adversary, Qatar. A year and a half ago, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt initiated a blockade against Qatar. The secretary says the fight among U.S.
The ongoing dispute in the region has dragged on too long, and the dispute benefits adversaries and harms our mutual interests.
The secretary says he also raised Jamal Khashoggi's murder and that he told the Crown Prince and King Salman that every person responsible for Khashoggi's death must be held accountable. Pompeo says both Saudi leaders acknowledged those responsible should be punished. Though after a CIA briefing late last year, several senior Democratic and Republican senators said the intel leads them to believe the Crown Prince was responsible. It's been more than 100 days since Jamal Khashoggi was murdered inside Saudi Arabia's consulate in Istanbul. The Saudi government says it has charged 11 suspects and is pursuing the death penalty against 5 of them. Brett?
Rich Edson traveling with the Secretary of State. Rich, thanks. There are new concerns tonight about Americans being held captive in Iran. Last week, Iran confirmed it is holding a U.S. Navy veteran, the first American seized since President Trump took office. Michael White is one of at least 4 Americans held prisoner in Iran. Tonight, the wife of another captive talks with national security correspondent Jennifer Griffin.
3 years ago, PhD student Zia Wang left his wife and 2-year-old son at Princeton for what he thought would be a quick trip to Tehran to research 19th century Central Asian politics. Instead, he became a victim of 21st century politics, arrested by Iranian police.
Iran says that he's a spy.
Yeah. He is not a spy. He's not a spy. He's just a history nerd. All he wants to do is to do a good research and then teach for the rest of his life.
He's now serving a 10-year term in Iran's notorious Evin prison, one of at least 4 Americans now being held. His wife, Hua, has been fighting for his freedom ever since. Her husband left home the same month the Iran nuclear deal took effect. Tehran released 5 American prisoners as part of the deal. For 20 days, she did not know where he was.
I received a phone call, and it was him crying to me that he was detained. So it was the time that he first came out of solitary confinement and gave me a phone call. And he literally cannot say anything. He just cried to me.
What did he say it was like in prison?
He cannot even properly form a sentence.
The State Department and UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention have publicly said Zia Wang is not a spy. Jane Manners was in the same Princeton PhD program.
He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was an American citizen in Iran right after Iran had released nearly all of its U.S. prisoners, and they perhaps needed more. That's a bargaining chip.
She described the impact on Wang's wife and 5-year-old son.
He's not sure where his dad is or when his dad is coming back.
3 years later, Wang's shoes wait by the front door as his family awaits his return.
This is all politics. My husband didn't do anything wrong.
In Princeton, New Jersey, Jennifer Griffin, Fox News.
Up next, a setback for President Trump's rollback of Obamacare regulations. We'll explain. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 5 in Atlanta, as the Transportation Security Administration says a passenger bound for Tokyo was able to pass through security at Atlanta's airport with an undetected gun. Officials have not yet said how that gun got through security. The TSA says standard procedures for screening were not followed. It happened January 2nd, about a week and a half into the partial government shutdown. Fox 7 in Austin, Texas, as a lawmaker says a Confederate plaque in the Texas Capitol that rejects slavery as the underlying cause of the Civil War has been removed. Democrat State Representative Eric Johnson tweeted a photo of the blank wall where the plaque once was displayed. He has long pushed the state to remove that plaque, which was made by the children of the Confederacy and was first hung in the Capitol in 1959. And this is a live look at Los Angeles from our affiliate, Fox 11. The big story there tonight, Pacific Gas and Electric says it plans to file for bankruptcy protection amid potentially massive liabilities resulting from the deadly California wildfires. Officials are investigating whether the utility's equipment sparked a wildfire in Northern California in November that killed at least 86 people and destroyed 15,000 homes. That's tonight's live look outside the Beltway from Special Report. We'll be right back.
Employers to opt out of mandatory birth control coverage for women.
Women must control their fate.
The fight is over an Obama-era mandate under the Affordable Care Act that employers provide free contraception. That law provided a narrow religious exemption. President Trump sought to expand.
We will not allow people of faith to be targeted, bullied, or silenced anymore.
The new rule would have allowed employers like the Little Sisters of the Poor to opt out based on religious or moral objections.
The Little Sisters actually have a real objection here. It's not financially motivated. It's not something that they're trying to do to be more profitable so that their shareholders can get more money. They don't have shareholders. The people that they're trying to serve are the elderly, poor, and dying.
But Planned Parenthood says the Trump policy is so broadly written, it could apply to corporations and investor-owned companies companies who might use the loophole to avoid paying for coverage.
This rule applies to any employer, whether they're a religious-based, faith-based organization or not, and it allows them to prevent your health insurance from covering birth control for any reason. It could be a religious reason, it could be a moral reason, it could be really anything at all.
Today's nationwide injunction follows a similar ruling Sunday from federal judge Haywood Gilliam in Oakland that applied only to Washington, D.C. and 13 states. Both judges were Obama appointees. The administration claims religious and moral objectors should not be forced into actions that conflict with their belief or conscience. Some believe this case will eventually end at the Supreme Court. Brett?
William, thank you. Tens of thousands of Los Angeles teachers are on strike tonight after contentious contract negotiations failed. Los Angeles is the nation's second largest school district. Union teachers voted last year to walk off the job for the first time in 3 decades if a deal was not reached on issues including higher wages and smaller class sizes. Schools will stay open because the district with 640,000 students has hired hundreds of substitutes to replace teachers and others who leave for picket lines. Stocks began the week on a down note. The Dow lost 86, the S&P 500 dropped 14, the Nasdaq fell 66. Up next, new blood versus old blood in the Democratic presidential race and the new heights of intimacy we might see on the trail. First, beyond our borders tonight, a Chinese court sentences a Canadian man to death in a sudden retrial of a drug smuggling case. The suspect was detained more than 4 years ago and initially sentenced to 15 years in prison. The resentencing is likely to affect diplomatic negotiations between the countries over the arrest of a top Chinese technology executive. British Prime Minister Theresa May is offering both a promise on workers' rights and a reassuring letter from European Union letters as she urges British lawmakers to support her floundering Brexit deal. A defeat tomorrow would throw Brexit plans into disarray, just weeks before the United Kingdom is due to leave the bloc on March 29th. Navy divers have recovered the cockpit voice recorder of a Lion Air jet that crashed into the Java Sea in October. That's according to Indonesian officials. They're still trying to determine why the 2-month-old plane nosedived at high velocity, killing all 189 people on board. Just some of the other stories beyond our borders tonight. We'll be right back. Former President Obama's presidential race, that comment, as you can imagine, is not going over too well with his former vice president, 76-year-old Joe Biden, who is considering a run. But there are 2 new contenders as of this weekend. Correspondent Kristen Fisher looks at how 2020 is shaping up for the Democrats.
I have decided to run and will be making a formal announcement within the next week.
With that, Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard became the first prominent Democrat to officially enter the 2020 race since Maryland Congressman John Delaney announced his intentions to run a year and a half ago. But right out of the gate, her history of working to pass a constitutional amendment to protect traditional marriage back in 1998 is once again coming under scrutiny. She's since said, "I regret the positions I took in the past." But the Republican National Committee believes she has no base of support. Liberals think she's too conservative. Conservatives think she's too liberal. The RNC also attacked the second Democratic candidate to enter the race this weekend, Julian Castro, by saying he's made history by becoming one of the biggest lightweights to ever run for president. But the former San Antonio mayor and Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, who's campaigning in Puerto Rico today, says he has the experience and he believes his relative youth is an asset.
It's time for new leadership. Because it's time for new energy.
Senator Elizabeth Warren hasn't officially announced she's running, but she sure sounded like it during a stop in New Hampshire on Saturday.
We need to make systemic change in this country.
But the biggest fish in this ever-growing Democratic sea would be former Vice President Joe Biden.
A lot of people say Biden's doing okay, but, you know, he was always a 1%er. He was a 1% guy. He ran 2 or 3 times. He never got above 1%.
Buzz is building that Biden's about to enter the race, even though just last week his old boss seemed to signal that Biden may not have his full support by saying of the Democratic Party, "We have a deficit of leadership and we need new blood."
And that new blood could be someone like Beto O'Rourke, who met with Mr. Obama in November. But don't forget about Senator Bernie Sanders. Politico is reporting that he just locked down his digital team from 2016. And Senator Kirsten Gillibrand is expected to form an exploratory committee in the coming days. Brett?
All right, Kristen, thank you. More on this with the panel. The 2020 campaign is already setting new standards when it comes to intimacy and social media. Tonight, Fox News media analyst and host of Fox's Media Buzz, Howard Kurtz, looks at just how far the transparency and sales job may go.
President Trump is the acknowledged master of making news with Twitter taunts. But the hot commodity these days is online video. Not of boring speeches, but of candidates doing everyday things. Beto O'Rourke, the failed Texas Senate candidate weighing a White House run, uses Instagram.
I'm here at the dentist, and we're going to continue our series on the people of the border.
Yes, they talked about the border, but much mockery ensued, with commentator Ben Shapiro tweeting his own dental moment, who wore it better. Another likely 2020 candidate, Senator Kamala Harris, is seen grooving here and declaring herself pro-dancing. When Elizabeth Warren announced her presidential exploratory committee, she wanted to show her comfort with a cold one.
Hold on a sec. I'm going to get me a beer. My husband Bruce is now in here.
The president tweeted about her, quote, beer catastrophe, saying if Pocahontas, as he calls the senator, had done the video with her husband dressed in full Indian garb, it would have been a smash. But the 2020 contenders are way behind Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the 29-year-old Democratic congresswoman with 4 million Instagram and Twitter followers who watch her cook.
Here you go. Here's the final product. We got some of our mac and cheese.
Yeah. Absolutely. Who cares?
The congresswoman responded with an emoji. We got under his skin. For politicians determined to seem real and authentic, not stiff and scripted, they can appear pretty hip when the videos work, or they can look decidedly uncool. Brett?
When they don't. Howie, thanks. President Trump insists he has never worked for the Russians, and he's insulted by the insinuation. Plus, is there an end to sight? Insight to the partial shutdown? We'll get reaction from the panel when we come back.
We're talking about border security. Who can be against it?
What we don't want to do is waste taxpayer money on a vanity project that's ineffective.
Border security ought to be driven by the experts, not by the political whims of a campaign promise where Trump said the wall was going to be built and was going to be paid for by Mexico.
It's common sense. What we're talking about is common sense.
That's where we are. We'll start with the partial government shutdown in day 24, longest ever in U.S. history. The president tweeting out today, I've been waiting all weekend. Democrats must get to work now. Border must be secured. Nancy and Crying Chuck can end the shutdown in 15 minutes. At this point, it has become their and the Democrats' fault. Well, at home, a lot of people polled don't think that way, at least according to the ABC Washington Post poll. Trump and Republicans responsible for the shutdown, 53%, Democrats 29%. There you see both equally at 13%. That's where we'll start with the panel. Let's bring them in. Chris Stirewalt, politics editor here at Fox News. Mo Alethia, executive director of the Georgetown Institute of Politics. And Ben Dominitz is the publisher of The Federalist. Okay, Mo, you heard Tim Kaine and Mark Warner putting the onus on not spending taxpayer money for something that doesn't work on the border. Could Democrats get to a place that says, here's this lump of money to the Border Patrol. You decide what to do with it as far as security.
I think Democrats are been pretty clear so far that they are not going to play with these federal workers as a negotiating chip, that they want the government open and then they will talk about it. Democrats have been clear that they want a holistic approach to border security, a holistic approach to immigration reform, but that they're not going to, they don't want to leave these federal workers in the lurch. And so far, at least in the PR wars, the American people are siding with them on this.
Ben.
I think that this question about who's to blame for the shutdown is the wrong question to be asking. It's the question that D.C. is asking. You listen to that comment from Tim Kaine about the money. This is not about the money. This is about sending a message in this case by the president to his base that, yes, I am, after 2 years of sort of not dealing with this promise, the biggest promise that I made, going to deal with this, and the message from Democratic leadership to their base that they're not going to show up in Washington and have their first act to be to bend over to this president on his signature issue. I think the president needs to lean more into the argument about what the Democrats' position really is, which is that they believe that this wall is immoral because they now believe that borders are immoral, or at least a significant portion of their base does. Put them in that position and lean into that argument more, because I think this internal conventional wisdom question about who's to blame for the shutdown, he's not going to win that.
I mean, to this point, Nancy Pelosi obviously used that word immoral. You've seen now Beto O'Rourke saying that it's racist, that the wall itself comes from a racist place. That seems like a pushback point, especially for those border state residents.
Especially with the Democrats junketeering to the beach in Puerto Rico. It would seem like it's a tailor-made moment, ready-made for a coherent Republican response here. But we do not get a coherent Republican response. And I think, to Ben's point, there are great avenues that Republicans could be following to keep the pressure on Democrats, but they do not. We hear the same thing over and over again. There's a crisis at the border. There's a crisis at the border. And everybody agrees, but we're still talking about the same thing. Democrats are at $1.6 billion. Republicans are at $5.7 billion, and no one has budged in either direction. The Republicans haven't come down, and the Democrats haven't gone up, and here we sit.
All right, here's Lindsey Graham over the weekend, the president's response.
If the legislative path is closed, and every day it goes by, it seems to be more closed rather than more open, and the only thing left with the president is the emergency declaration. And I suggested to him, before you pull that trigger, see if you can have a short-term CR to see if we can get there.
I did reject it, yes. I'm not interested. I want to get it solved. I don't want to just delay it. I want to get it solved.
All right, so what is the path? Is there a point? How do we get from here to there? Does anybody know?
No, I don't think anyone knows yet. But look, I think at some point this is going to be untenable. This is already the longest shutdown in American history. You've got people who are now getting zero on their pay stubs. People aren't able to pay their rent. And it's not just the federal workers, it's all the contractors. We're seeing these lines at airports. If that starts to become institutionalized, there's going to be a pressure point from which I think even this president will not be able to come back from.
There's no incentive for him to shift off of this at this moment. It's going to take a lot more time and I think a lot more pain before you have any really willingness on the part of either side here to budge, given how much this is central to their message.
You said it doesn't matter who's to blame, but is there a point where you think it tips and people say, hey, where's the deal? Or?
I think that there is going to be a moment when that happens, but I think we're a long way off from it.
All right, I want to quickly get to this Russia story. The president vigorously pushing back today on these stories about the FBI opening this investigation, saying I never worked for Russia. What about this?
Can I just say how sick I am of these stories? So the New York Times story was an interesting, revelatory thing. The Washington Post was an interesting, revelatory thing. It gets treated all out of boundaries on all sides. Of course, the take from, I think it was, no offense to Peter Baker, but I think it was the lead of his story, that when Judge Janine asked Donald Trump, do you work for the Russians, that he didn't give her a straight answer. I don't think that was ambiguous. I think that he was saying, I think he's been very clear that he is innocent here and he didn't do the things wrong. I think we have so much Mueller expectation. Everybody is so ready for Mueller that any fish that swims by, everybody says is the great white shark. I think we got to continue to pace ourselves and breathe a little bit here.
Here's Jonathan Karl on ABC over the weekend about all of this.
People who are closest to what Mueller has been doing, who have interacted with the special counsel, caution me that this report is almost certain to be anticlimactic. That if you look at what the FBI was investigating in that New York Times report, you look at what they were investigating, Mueller did not go anywhere with that investigation.
Mo?
Only Bob Mueller knows what Bob Mueller has, and only Bob Mueller knows when we're all going to find out. Look, I think the past week we've seen more than just a couple of fish, right? I think these have been pretty big fish, but at the end of the day, we won't know until we see it, and I think we should give him all the space he needs to put together a comprehensive report.
And there's no indication that they're not going to do that.
After years of this, we still have no evidence that the president treasonously colluded with with the Russian government to obtain his election. We do have a mountain of evidence that the FBI and the DOJ had a number of people who acted inappropriately to start investigations that they spun up because of the president's politics, because of how he regarded Russia. Imagine if we had the FBI investigating President Obama after his comments to Medvedev about his flexibility after the coming election.
No, in fairness,
it's completely out of line, and it should be something that should arouse a lot more concern on the parts of the people who want us to trust these institutions, who believe these institutions need to be trusted in order for us to move forward.
In fairness, we have seen the president's then campaign manager evidence that he had some pretty interesting and remarkable relationships with the Russians.
The idea that Paul Manafort is a bad guy is not a new thing at this table.
But it's not. It's more than him being a bad guy. The question is there evidence that the president's campaign colluded with the Russians? There may be evidence right there. All I'm saying is we won't know everything until the full report is done, and the efforts by some to silence it, saying it's taken too long, let the man have as much time as he needs.
Okay, but my point is that the administration so far is not saying that. They're not silencing it. They're letting it go. Bill Barr, who's up tomorrow, says let it go, and he's the AG nominee. Okay, we say a lot of that at the same time. Next up, new blood versus old blood in 2020.
Here I am, in the United States.
I am a candidate for President of the United States of America.
I have decided to run and will be making a formal announcement within the next week.
We've spent a lot of time in Iowa. We've done 21 trips there, 12 to New Hampshire. And I think my message, which is about bringing this terribly divided nation back together.
I got to make sure that there is that grassroots support. And that's what we're ascertaining. If there is, I'll run. If there isn't, I won't.
A lot of people say Biden's doing okay, but, you know, he was always a 1%er. We'll see what happens with him.
Well, the field is starting to take shape. Democratic candidates, there are potentially a lot of them, really a cast of thousands, as we get ready to hear all of their decisions, whether they're running or not. Meantime, the president has taken to Twitter to basically troll them. Best line in the Elizabeth Warren beer catastrophe is to her husband, quote, "Thank you for being here. I'm glad you're here. It's their house. He's supposed to be there." The president tweeting about that video from Elizabeth Warren. We're back with the panel. Thoughts early on this race as it's forming?
You know, the comedian-in-chief in the White House, I think, is going to be offering his color commentary throughout this entire process. It's going to be fascinating to see that play out. Trump. The question is whether they're also going to be anti-Trump voter, anti-appealing to Trump voters, which I view to be kind of the key divide right now that's taking shape in the field. Do you try to win back some of those Trump voting people in the middle of the country, or do you write them off and not care about them? One of the most interesting developments I think, is the entrance of Tulsi Gabbard into this race. She's sort of a younger, more telegenic version of Bernie Sanders. I don't know if she's going to end up taking away significant support from him. He does seem committed to continuing to run. But again, it's the question of, do you even try to appeal to those working class voters, or do you just write them off?
Mo, was there a signal being sent by President Obama, former President Obama, saying they need new blood in the Democratic Party? I mean, if anything, that's a pretty stark message to Joe Biden.
Well, look, I think there's no question that the Democratic Party writ large needs to sort of embrace this new generation of up-and-comers and elevate them. Does that mean it needs to be at the top of the ticket? I don't know. The voters are going to decide that. Democratic primary voters are going to decide that. I think it's interesting that there's going to be a number of different fissures that I think emerge throughout the course of this primary. There's going to be an urban versus rural fissure. There's going to be a generational divide. There's going to be, obviously, gender divide. There's going to be generational. So there's going to be all sorts of different things. Ben's right that all of them are going to be unified in their opposition to the president. But what is the proactive message that they are each going to offer, I think, is actually going to be bigger than any of those divides.
CBS reporting Kristen Gillibrand coming out tomorrow on the Late Show on CBS. It's crowding up right now, but now is also the phase where you get grifters, weirdos, people who are looking to raise their visibility. You got no chance. Maybe you're running for vice president. Get in early. You can get a bunch of interviews. You can get some airtime. You can get seen. And then when it doesn't work out, nobody will ever remember. It'll be fine. So now's the time.
Over under 20 candidates in.
By the time we'll go over 20 for a period of time, but I think we'll retreat back under 20 pretty quickly.
I think that's about right.
I think, yes, the same as Chris.
All right. Chris is always, just go with it. Yeah. When we come back, a White House spread worthy of national champions.